Hey everybody, welcome to part two of my podcast series on uh, homelessness in San Francisco and drug addiction and treatment. As I mentioned in part one, these things tend to go together. Um, there's some overlap between people who are unhoused in San Francisco and people who are drug addicted in San Francisco. It's not like every unhoused person is a drug addict. That's not the way it is. But there is definitely some overlap. So we're going to talk about, what services are currently available in San Francisco for people who are either unhoused or who have serious drug problems, which is contributing to their being unhoused. Again, not everyone who's unhoused has a serious drug problem, but there is a fair amount of overlap between those things. So first, let's talk about the housing. Obviously, actual housing in San Francisco is extremely expensive. Homes are not affordable unless you're wealthy. And rents are not affordable unless you make really good money. So what do you do if you're in San Francisco and you're not wealthy, you no longer have a job, let's say, that pays you good money? Well, obviously you could leave, but for the people who don't, some of those folks end up homeless, and some folks end up homeless for other reasons, like serious drug or alcohol problems or a mental illness. So for folks who do find themselves on the streets in San Francisco unhoused, what is available? Where can they stay if they wanted to actually stay indoors? Well, we do have a Salvation Army downtown. That's an organization some of you may be familiar with. It's been around for a long, long time, more than 100 years. And they do have a limited number of beds, which they usually reserve for people with alcohol dependency who are unhoused. Of course, Salvation Army is a religious organization, and it does require that you attend their services or sermons, and that you maintain abstinence in order to stay in a bed. And because there's only one real facility for the Salvation Army, the number of beds is very limited. Keep in mind there's more than 8,000 unhoused people in San Francisco on any given night. Now, we do have in San Francisco quite a few dedicated shelters. Hope House for Women is one of them. That's a women's only shelter near downtown, but most of them centered near the downtown area, but there's a lot of dedicated shelters. And these are places where people can go and stay for free. They don't charge. A lot of them actually do provide a little bit of food as well for folks. Most of them, though, some of them are co-ed, some of them are segregated, like Hope House. Probably for women, the segregated ones are safer and better. Some of them are dedicated to certain groups, like there's one for teenagers, runaway teenagers, etc. On any given night, the city has about a bit over 3,000 shelter beds available, but keep in mind it's got over 8,000 unhoused people. So not enough shelter beds for everyone who is unhoused, certainly not even quite enough for half that number. And the shelter beds are usually pretty full on any given night, more than 90% occupancy in San Francisco. That is, more than 90% of these shelter beds, these 3,000 plus shelter beds, are actually occupied. But again, that's less than half of the unhoused population in San Francisco. Also, generally in most shelters, you can't reserve a shelter bed. So it's a constant cycle of every morning you have to kind of wait in line to, or maybe in the afternoon, you have to wait in line to try to get one of the limited beds. Even if you were in a bed, the night before, you probably will still the next day have to wait in line again to try to get, a bed again. So it's pretty inconvenient. And again, some of these shelters are not the nicest places. They're, crowded, dangerous, risky. Um, some of them are better than others. The ones that are dedicated to particular groups, like the women's shelters and the teen shelters, they tend to be much better than just the general shelters where they sort of just let anyone spend the night who couldn't wait for it. So anyway, those are the the main places that unhoused people can stay for free overnight and get out of the cold, essentially get off the street and inside into an actual bed or a cot. Now, all around the city, there are places that are essentially SROs, single room occupancy places. A lot of those are converted old motels and stuff, motels that the owners gave up on, that city purchased and converted. And the SROs, what they are is, basically you rent for very low rent. You rent a room in a building, and it's just a room. It's got a bed and maybe a desk or a dresser. And the SROs, they have usually bathroom facilities, but they're not in the room. They're down the hall. You share them with everybody else on your floor. Some SROs have like communal kitchens, areas where the entire building's population can go and cook stuff. Although a lot of places, a lot of the SROs, people just like put microwaves or in their rooms, and that's what they cook with. So there are a fair number of SROs. There's about 500 buildings in the city that are designated SRO buildings. They have about 20,000 rooms. The problem with SROs, though, is if you're truly indigent, if you're homeless, on the street, no money, not easy to get into an SRO. SROs do charge rent, so you got to pay something every month. If you have no money, you can't pay rent. SROs also tend to have wait lists, and there's a sort of an application process to get an SRO. So you've got to be one of these designated groups that get priority placement into SROs, and then you really, once you get in, you need an income. So you need to be able to work in order to maintain your spot in the SRO. So those exist, and there are plenty of them in the city, but because of these restrictions in getting in applications, payment and job requirements, there's a lot of the folks, those 8,000 unhoused people, a lot of them wouldn't be able to qualify, at least not right away, for an SRO. Other places people tend to spend the night, hospital ERs, just because they're warm and have cushiony seats. If somebody's really having like a psychotic episode and stuff, they may end up getting taken to a hospital and put into a psych ward where they can be held for a few days. We no longer have involuntary commitment for people who have serious mental illness. In the old days, they used to be able to put people in these psych wards indefinitely, essentially forever. But nowadays you can't do that. You can hold them for 3 days, sometimes a few days longer, but then you have to let them go. And of course, there are jails. If a homeless person gets picked up on the street, and maybe they committed a petty crime or they were caught with drugs or whatever, they may get put in jail pending their arraignment and sentencing or trial. So, a fair number of, at some point or another, a fair percentage of homeless folks actually do end up in jail, and that's where they end up spending the nights. Okay, so those are what's available now for people who are on the street. So if you find yourself on the street, you can try to get into a shelter. If you have a little money or still are kind of working a job a little bit, you might be able to get one of these agencies that we'll talk about in a minute to help you get on a wait list for an SRO. And maybe you can get into an SRO, which is a step above shelter. But otherwise, you're looking at, not very good options here. Now, if you have a drug problem, and that's what's either put you on the street or is keeping you on the street or helping to keep you on the street, there are options. There are things available to you. Again, it's pretty limited. For example, San Francisco has a few what they call sobering centers, where if you're having a particularly bad high or you took too much of a drug or whatever and you just you can't function, you just need to sleep it off. We do have a few sobering centers in the city. Again, bed space is limited, but sobering centers are places where you can spend usually up to 12 hours. Sometimes they'll let you stay a little longer than that, but not very long. You can't stay over, in 2 days or anything. What they do is they're just trying to get you through, the worst of the high until you really start to come down and regain your faculties again. There are people with some medical training on staff at sobering centers all the time, 24/7. They can monitor people's vitals, their blood pressure, their heart rate, their body temperature, make sure they're not, in a serious medical situation. Sobering centers have food and liquids available for people. There's Narcan there for somebody who's having an opiate overdose. More importantly, though, the people in the sobering centers, they usually have social service folks. They can help connect people with more long-term, help if that's what they want. Some people just go there repeatedly to these sobering centers just to sort of, they realize that when they're in a really severely intoxicated state, when they're severely high, that they can't protect themselves on the street. So they don't feel safe on the street. They may get very paranoid. So they go into a sobering center and basically sleep it off until they come down enough to function out in the real world a little bit, and then they leave. I think they said the average visitor to a sobering center, will go to the sobering center many dozens of times in a year. But that's okay. I mean, it does provide folks in a very vulnerable state with, some supervision, somebody watching over them, and people who can connect them with services and treatment if they need it, particularly if they need something kind of treatment. They're in a medically bad situation, they need more treatment than can be given at the center. Okay, as far as detox goes, when they either overdose on a drug or when they're going through withdrawals from a drug because they've stopped taking it and they can't get any more for whatever reason, or they've chosen not to, generally that has to be managed in a hospital emergency room. Now, obviously, emergency room beds are extremely limited in the city, and because usually people with these problems don't have good health insurance. The only hospitals that will take them is the county hospital, which is San Francisco General, which has a detox unit, and I think UC San Francisco, which also has a detox unit. But beyond that, the other hospitals in the city are private hospitals, and they're not going to take in people without insurance. But, if somebody's having severe mental breakdown, like a psychotic episode, schizophrenia, or they're going through a life-threatening overdose or life-threatening withdrawal symptoms, then usually whoever picks them up off the street, an ambulance, a police officer will take them to the county hospital ER, like the San Francisco General Emergency Room, where they can be medically managed so they don't die. Now, for a longer-term treatment with drug addiction, there are inpatient rehabs in San Francisco. There aren't many of these. Inpatient rehabs are places where people can actually stay, where there's a bed, where they can stay for 30 or 60 or 90 days, or sometimes up to a year, where there's food that's free, where there's drug testing and treatment that's free, where there's therapy that's free. One such place is Walden House, which is funded by basically Medicaid funded through and run by a private organization. As you might imagine, the number of beds for this kind of intensive inpatient drug treatment that's free is very limited. There may be just in the entire city a few hundred beds for people in this situation. And often those beds are taken up mostly by people who are court mandated to go into these places. Now, there are a much larger number of outpatient rehab centers in San Francisco, run by all different organizations with all different levels of outpatient managed care. There are a lot of free ones. There are dozens of ones that don't charge people because they're funded through either private donations or Medicaid. We call that Medi-Cal here in California. And San Francisco AIDS Foundation, for example, runs outpatient rehab through their Stonewall Project. So these places usually have pretty good services: drug testing, therapy, group, individual, needle exchanges. Some of them have clinics where they do basic health screening, STD testing, where they can give medications to help people manage drug withdrawals. They also tend to have classes. They tend to have job and housing assistance. So a lot of them are really one-stop shops that are fairly full service, but they are outpatient. So if you're homeless, unhoused, they don't help you with that. I mean, they can help you with it, and they can try to set you up with some housing assistance, like get you on a list for an SRO. Or try to place you in a job, or help you get placed, or help you write a resume. But for like an immediate need, like if you have no place to sleep tonight, those outpatient rehab centers aren't going to be able to help you with that. Although they may be able to hook you up with one of these other things, like they can call around to shelters or SROs to see if there's a free SRO room somewhere that maybe you could stay at, but for a night. So it's not like they can't help at all, but they may not be able to get you into something right away. One thing I didn't mention here, which I certainly should, is of course there's tons of AA and NA groups throughout the city, and a lot of people find that joining Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous groups is helpful for them to help them be supported in maintaining sobriety and maintaining sobriety. So just like in any city, pretty much in the country, at least in any city of any size, San Francisco has its share of 12-step groups, which obviously are free, and they usually have coffee and cookies. Of course, they won't provide you with shelter or these other services, but a supportive group to help you try to stay sober is helpful too. So these are the things that are currently available. And I think the most obvious thing right up front is that there aren't enough beds. There aren't enough for all the people that need these various services. Not enough detox beds in the hospitals, not enough beds in the sobering centers, not enough inpatient rehab beds for the number of people who actually need these services, which is thousands every night in San Francisco. And as far as just, shelter goes, there's only enough, as I said, the shelters are not always that nice. A lot of people just really don't want to stay there and don't feel safe there. But even for the people who do, there's only enough dedicated shelter beds in San Francisco for about half of the unhoused population. So one obvious issue when you look at this right away is lack of places, lack of space, lack of beds, also lack of caretakers for all the people on any given night who might need these services. So obviously an expansion of some of these things as far as the offerings go, the number of beds, number of people involved in care would certainly help. Okay, so that's, I think, what I want to say for what's available now in San Francisco. And I think you can see from what is available why there are, still so many people on the streets, in any given night. There, aren't enough services for everyone who might want one. There aren't enough beds for everyone who might need one. And some people who are, deep in addiction or, have mental illness or whatever may not want to take advantage of what is there. They may not even really be able to, and they may not be aware of the services. So, not everyone who's an addict is ready right now to, try to get sober. Not everyone who's sleeping outside wants to sleep in a shelter. Quite a few people don't for various reasons. And so we have a dual issue here. One is the issue of there really not being enough services for everybody who might need it and want it, and not enough beds for everyone who might need one or want one. But also, not everybody wants it. In fact, quite a few people don't. So, what do you do? What do you do if you have a person, maybe they're deep in addiction, but they can't face getting sober right now. Or maybe they're mentally ill, or maybe they just think shelters are dangerous, horrible places, and they'd rather just sleep under the stars. Or in their own little tent. So what do you do about that group? And what do you do about the other group? People who actually do want services who just can't get it because there's not enough available. So there's two different groups you're really looking at. When you talk about dealing with this problem, right? There's two different groups you're really dealing with. One is the group of, yes, I want service, I want help, but I can't find it, or it's not available to me right away. And the other is, no, I don't want service, I don't want help right now. Maybe I will later, but I don't want it now. I'd rather just live the way I'm living, even though it's objectively not a great way to live. So, how do you deal with those two diverse groups? And of course, within each of those groups, there are subgroups, like groups with mental illness versus groups that have drug addiction, groups that have both, groups that don't have either. They just are economically homeless. So we'll talk about that. Because the approaches, I think, for these different groups would have to be maybe a bit different. Yeah, so I think I said a while ago that was all I was going to say, but I had more to say. So now I think that's all I have to say for now for this part. The third part, third chapter of our podcast is really going to deal with, what can we do about this? What can we do to mitigate this problem? Because, yeah, it's a problem. I mean, it's weird to me. I go into San Francisco not all the time, but frequently enough, even now, where I've certainly seen this up close and personal. And what's strange to me is when you pass by what's going on some of these streets, watching people shoot up, really lost in addiction, lying on the sidewalk, going to the bathroom in doorways, just in a bad way, living what looks like a pretty bad life from the outside. It's your heart breaks, and you're seeing, because you're witnessing this human degradation. And what's weird about it is, if you in any given town, if you were just walking down the street in a nice neighborhood, a good neighborhood, where mostly middle class or affluent people, and you saw someone lying on the street in distress, maybe they're clutching their chest or they're vomiting or whatever, but they were a person that didn't look all disheveled, and smell nasty. They were a person maybe in a business suit or a dress, a nice dress, and you saw that person, you would probably go right over and try to help them. You'd say, "What's wrong? Can I call an ambulance? Can I, get you some water?" Whatever. You wouldn't let them lie there and suffer. But when we see people in similar distress who look like they live there, who look like this is their life, and maybe they don't, they're dressed bad and they're dirty and they smell bad, we are like, whoa, we walk around them, we step over them. So it's our reaction to humans in distress on the street is very different depending on how we assess the condition of the human. That is, when I say condition, I don't mean their physical condition. I mean how their economic condition. How close are they to us economically? Are they middle class like we are? Then we stop and help. Are they destitute and disheveled and drug addicted? Then we give them a wide berth. Now that says something about us, because in both cases you're looking just at a human in distress, right? It says something about us that we react very differently depending on how we assess the value of the human. So I think going into the third podcast where we talk about some possible, solutions to this, I think that's something to think about is, not just what's going on with these folks, but our response to it. Okay, so see you next time.